In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this funky, trippy shader with Unity's shader graph. It has lots of variations, as you can see here. It's relatively easy to understand, and of course there's always so many things you can do with it. I had a hard time to even figure out like which one should I use for this tutorial, because there are just way too many things you can do with this thing. So let's get started. For this tutorial I'm going to use a bit of a simplified version. What I just showed you, there were multiple textures, they're getting layered on top of each other, offset a little bit. Doesn't really matter, of course. Once you have this effect, you can layer things on top any way you want. So I figured for explaining it, it's a lot easier if you only see one. So let's take a look at this shader, and with Shift and Space, I can go full screen mode. So here on top, what we have is the color change. We can ignore that for now. We're going to talk about that later. But at its core, it's really, we have this texture and we want to put this on top of the object, and whatever we get out of this, we want to use this for the alpha. So it's important that you go into graph settings, set surface type to transparent, and I also use alpha clipping, because if you don't, then there is this wicked issue where like I don't know, it's gonna look weird and it's a bit complicated to work around it. Because the shader kind of gets confused which face is in front of which other face and so on. Doesn't matter, set it to alpha clipping, make your life so much easier, and then we can just put this really low, which means that any value above 0.09 is going to get full alpha. And this is what we're going to do with all these textures here, right? So put this in, and we take the same output, multiply it with the color, I mentioned we're going to do that a little bit later, and put that into the emission. And so the base color in a way doesn't even matter, because wherever we show something, we also show emission. So that's just going to override the base color. Unless you would take like a really low emission color and like a really strong lighting. Yeah, I mean, I don't even use a light in the scene I just showed you. So the base color gets pretty much ignored. Right, so this is the basic principle. And so now the question is, how do we get a texture? And I'm using this one here I got from textures.com. It's called Bamboo Wall. And this is the height map, just black and white. Originally to show you where the bamboo sticks out a little bit, so it's thicker here. But I was just looking for something like stripes with some cool variation. And it's also seamless, so I can put this one right next to each other, and that means I can tile it and there won't be like this very weird hard line in between. So very useful texture. You can use your own, you can layer multiple ones, but I think this one has a lot of potential. So basically what you're seeing is a snail getting textured by a bamboo wall with funky colors. And now the question is, how do we get this texture onto our object? And for this I use this position node, and I set the space to object. And here I need to switch the axis a bit, and let me show you that. So let me simplify this a bit. We don't need any of that. Let's put here. Okay, so I'll save this, and I'm gonna go back to my scene. And yeah, so I just stopped the offset and everything, right? Let's bring my texture back. And so when you use the object node, what it refers to is whatever object this material is sitting on. Right, so this is the body. Let me move this up and down. You can also hide the shell. That is the shell. Yeah. Right, and so basically I want to use this. I hope you can see you have the blue. That is the z-axis. Wait, I had the house selected, but the body is the same. So the z-axis and the x-axis. The texture is always gonna go from y. Oh, let me use my awesome annotation tool. It goes from Y. That is not working with pure ref. Okay. That is not a straight line. Doesn't matter. I'm drawing with my hand, so it's a good line. Texture always goes from X to Y, right? And this is 0, and then this is 1, 1. And so I want to say, okay, I want to take the Z of the object and have this become the Y. And the X can actually stay the same, right? I just use the X here and then F. Okay, so if I go back to the hologram, I'm still painting. That's why I do this splitting around, right? So I say the position, and RGB, that's the X, Y, and Z. Unfortunately, can't change that, but it is what it is. So we say the X can stay the X, but as said, I want the Z to become the Y. And this is why I do this like weird axis switching. And of course, if you put this on an object that has a different orientation, then you can use this part here and figure out like which axis you want. So now we have that and we plug that into the UV, while the texture here, there I assigned the one from textures.com, the bamboo one. This is then basically this, yeah. So we hide the graph inspector. Here what I'm doing, this is just some fine tuning. This would work just fine. I showed that in the last video. So as long as there aren't any curves, I'm using this gradient as a bit of a poor man's workaround. So what I want to do is I just want to kind of like push the contrast a bit. And so I use a gradient and I sample this gradient, and then I use the alpha of this gradient as my new 0 to 1 value. This might be a bit confusing if you're used to Blender doing materials like color ramps. That's basically what I'm doing here, right? So what I'm getting out of this here is a value between 0 and 1. 0 for the black, 1 for the pure whites. When I say this gradient and I use this sample gradient node, what I'm saying is when I plug in 0, I want to get selection tool, but 0, whatever the value is here. When I plug in 1, I want to get whatever value is here. And the value I'm asking it is the alpha, not the RGB. You could do the same, it's just a little bit easier to adjust. And for obvious reasons, I asked like if I plug in what's the gray values, they will be like 0.5. I want them to be a different value now, whatever we have here. Let me do that. And if I click on here, I can see the gradient. I'm using alpha, which means only this ones here on top. They will be my new values. So 255, that's the maximum alpha. That's going to give me 1. 0, of course, going to be 0. And now I can use this to kind of fine tune this, right? So for example, I say like, okay, you know what? Anything on this original that is going to be between, say like 0 and 0.2 here, just make it pure black. I don't want to have this like low gray values. So I can push, oops, I just made a new one. And when I hit delete, moved, so I can push it like this. Now I can say, you know what, anything that's like 0.8 to 1 in terms of brightness, I want this to be pure white. So I could use this white, or could even slide this. And now I'm really pushing the contrast on this thing. Yeah, now I kind of forgot what I had. Well, but it was not that. God damn it. And the reason I'm using alpha instead of color is because when I use alpha, I get this nice slider here. I could also say, okay, I play around with the color, but then I always have to go into this color here and do like this and slide around. And of course, if you do like different color, then it's always going to take the average of those 3 values, right? Or you could use the red, whatever. Doesn't matter, but it's just easier to say, okay, you know what? I don't even care about the color. I only want these things on the top. Alpha, I get this nice slider here. And then of course the output, I need to split it and say, no, I only want the alpha. This is going to be my new 0 to 1. Yeah, so this is pretty much it. This is just like my poor man workaround for a curve. Fresnel effect, I think pretty self-explanatory. Maybe I shouldn't say that if you never used the Fresnel effect. So basically, like depending on the angle that we're looking on something, we're getting a value out of it, right? Basically, very similar to when you look at water. Like when you look straight down on water, you get no reflection. But when you look at it, like just basically your head is almost inside the water, and you're looking on like very flat. The angle is almost 180 degrees. You get like this really strong reflection. You see the sky basically. So this is what this Fresnel effect simulates. With the power, you can just say how strong you want it. And the reason I'm doing that is, actually, we can set this to 0. And when I save this, you can see now it's, yeah, you still got the stripes, but you're kind of losing the form. So this really helps to say like, okay, let's have at least a bit something, you know. And then you see where we look like really flat on these surfaces, we're getting this effect. That means we're always seeing a bit of the form. So that just helps. And then we just add it at this point to here. This node you can actually ignore, that's where I plugged in basically all of this. I plugged it into this again, so I can layer this. Okay, so now we have the texture onto the object, but we also want to move it, and this is where this part comes in. Right, so for the offset, if it just stays like that, nothing's gonna happen. Let me plug that one in. Only change the tiling here. Tiling is just vector 2, right? So you can increase the scale, decrease the scale. Now for the offset, of course, once we start moving something here, right, we get this nice effect. And to move it constantly, we just use the whoops. Easy. Use the time node. Use the time as the output, and I multiply this. That is just a vector 2. For the example you saw, I had it to 0 and 1 because I don't even want to move it on the x-axis, just on the y-axis. So multiply the speed with the output of the time. The adding, we're going to get to that in a moment. For now, we can just put it like this. And let me see my blackboard. Where is the stripes 1 speed? That's what I'm using. See the value. Okay, so it's 0 and 0.2. So now we have that one moving. And as you can see now it moves, and I think it already looks quite cool. Now to have a bit of variation, maybe we don't want to move them completely straight in this line, but let me check this one. It's the same one too. Tiling, yes, stripes 1 speed, right? So I'm moving on the Y, of course I can increase this, make it faster. If I go into negative, then I move in the other direction. I could use the X here and now just have them move to the side. But I think it would be actually more interesting, that is what I showed you in the beginning, if they're kind of like jittering a bit to the side. And so for this is where the noise comes in, right? So we're saying, okay, we still want to have like this. Oh, let me go to full screen. Of course, we want to have the speed multiplied by time, so they're always moving in the Y direction, rather they always move in one direction. For the X, wouldn't it be cool if we could enter a value that kind of gets like jittery, so adding a little bit of X. And for this I used a Vonoid noise. So noise waves, that is just a float, and I plug in the time. Why am I using this? Because I have this angle offset here. It's really cool. Let me delete this because then it becomes more obvious. What we can do with this angle offset is we can rotate this noise. Right, so if I keep constantly increasing it, I get this like cool kind of organic movement. So this is why, once again, I use a time node. I use a float so I can drive the speed in the inspector. Multiply this, and then I plug this into the angle offset. And now they're moving kind of like bacteria. And now the question is once again, okay, like how do we want to apply this? And I just used this one that I did before where I split it and I this one out. And I say, okay, based on what we already calculated here, I now want to be able to offset x-axis. Which is why, so first I use the noise strength. Once again, just another float so I can play around with the value a bit in the inspector. And then I use the multiply. So we can multiply the output of this. I plug this into a vector 2 because I only want to influence the x-axis. Actually, totally up to you, right? If you do it on the y, actually, yeah, let's do that for this tutorial. And this is why I mentioned before, you can play around with like wherever and you can try all kinds of different. But if you only want to have an offset on the x-axis, of course, plug it into vector 2 and then only use the x, use this one in here. And so we have this movement speed. Keep in mind, this is the constant value, and this is what we add on top. And let's into the offset. And you can always see right now we're getting this jittering effect. And now they're kind of jittering. And let's see where I put the noise strength here. And if you do it really high, you have to like really fine tune it. This one here, but then they just get completely twisted around. Might look cool too, but you know. So I think 0.1 is already really strong. Wow. 0.05, even too strong. Okay. 0.01. My keyboard is on German, god damn it. 0.01. Yeah, now you get like a little bit of jittery effect. And because now they're no longer moving in a straight X line, but you know, the X just gets offset a little bit. And it gets offset based on the object position that was plugged in, but also the noise which is moving. That's this wicked bacteria-like, right? So it multiplies that and says, where are we on the object position? But you know what, let's also change this bit based on this Voronoi noise, which of course is constantly getting animated. And this is why you get this like cool, let's just say what it is. It looks like a cartoon sperm animation. Now, what you could also do is you could use the UVs, right? We're not just plugging in this one here. Let me delete this one. Save the asset. So the UVs, of course, is whatever you unwrapped your 3D model. The body is actually not unwrapped very nicely. But then you can get like a different effect. And I think you can see it clearly on the shell, which I unwrapped myself. You can see this line here, right? Because I tried to unwrap the shell in a way that like the UVs go from like the entire shell from start to bottom, which I somewhat failed in the end. Have to do that again in Blender. Because I think then you could have like UV going around and inside the sphere. That would be super cool for some effects. I'll do that soon. But yeah, now we're multiplying it with the UV map. And yeah, then you get some really cool, funky effects too. And so, you know, totally up to you what you can do with it. So many things. I kind of like the UV a little bit more, to be honest. Okay, now the last thing then we need to talk about is, okay, how do we get the color? Go from one color to the other, right? And so we have color 1 and color 2, and I want to lerp in between. So we have a smooth gradient. Lerp takes a value between 0 and 1. Should be careful, and unfortunately also takes values way below that, but just like in, it's basically in C#, like on Unity's C# like lerp, but it's unclamped. This one, that's just for testing, right? So I have this bool called test color lerp, and I plug this into this branch. Like, if this is true, then what I actually want to plug into this lerp value is my own float, that is a slider from 0 to 1. And so that's just for testing. Let me show you that real quick. So go in here. Because sometimes you have two colors and the in-between kind of sucks. The in-between might be white or really not what you want. So if I check color lerp, now the entire thing gets colored. If I say 0, it's taking color 1. If I move it to 1, it takes color 2. And then I can just test this and see, okay, this is what the in-between looks like. I think that's still okay. But you know, you might have two colors. Maybe you have, it's not a screen. It's somewhat nicer. Let's take this one. And then maybe this second. Oh yeah, so if I say like, let's see what the lerp is gonna look like. Don't have to play around that much. And you see, I don't know, it kind of loses its color. So I can put this in the middle. So like here, the color looked a bit bland. Maybe I find something that looks kind of nicer. Or maybe increase this one. Then I can say, you know what? I think that's a nicer in between. So this is really just for testing. Of course, when I disable this bool, now we're using this one. What this one is, I'm going to show you now. It refers to, you know, once again, a bit of noise. We take the object position. Oh, this is just the flickering. This is from Bracky's tutorial. Okay, let's get this out of the way real quick. So we use the time. We plug this into a random range. A random range just needs any kind of value and turn this into a value between 0 and 1. And then we compare and we say, okay, whenever this random value is between 0 and 9, we plug this into a branch, right? So it's a Boolean. Once again, if it's higher, then it's 2. That means now we're getting a 1 out of this. Otherwise, we're getting a 0.8 out of this. When we use this to multiply our entire emission, you get this flickering effect, right? So this is basically every frame, and wait, we check 0.9, so 10% of the time we are getting a value of 1, and 90% of the time getting a value of 0.8. Now that I said that, I realized I probably should have done it the other way around, but whatever, just some flickering. But now onto the color, that is this part. And so I want to color it based on the object position. So exactly the same what we're using here, right? I have a position node, I set the space to object, I split it, I want the Z position, I only care about the Z position. Obviously you could color it on the Y position from bottom to top or something. So I take this one, I split the Z, and I remap it to a value between 0 and 1. And the thing that I remap is the color range, and that is basically, that completely depends on the object. However big it is, I want to be like X value where it starts, the Y value where it ends. So I can say this is the object basically from start to beginning, its entire Z dimension. I want to plug that in, get 0 to 1 out of it, makes things a lot easier. And then let's say, you know what, this would be a super smooth gradient, but that might look, I mean, depends what you want, might look a bit bland, so we can just add some noise, right? And once again, I just plug in this entire object position, which means now you also get a bit of variation on the X and the Y. Plug this in, get a value, and just add it to whatever I remap this from 0 to 1. And here I saturate the node so it doesn't go way beyond, because I might be wrong about the color range, or rather not wrong, but I might set this to -30 or something, and oops, sorry, and then things would get super funky, because what I get out of then here is okay, so here I use a saturate node that is just clamping it between 0 and 1. The reason is that this remap is not clamped 0 and 1, right? So I might say the color range, I might estimate for some reason, maybe because I'm lazy, and I say, oh, my object, it goes from like -1 to 4, so its entire Z dimension is 5 units. I plug this in, so calculate this to 0 and 1, but in reality it's actually like 50 units wide, and then what the shader does, it's gonna plug in -50. It says, oh wow, -50, that's like really low, and it says like 40, the vertices that are at 40, oh, they're gonna get a value of like, in this case, that would be 10. If I get 10 out of here, and I plug this into the lerp, then the lerp, which I'd really appreciate if it only took a value between 0 and 1, but it doesn't. If you plug in 10, it's gonna way overshoot. It's gonna say, okay, I'm gonna go from this color to this color, and then 10 times more. Let's see what this is gonna get, where it's gonna get you some crazy, usually it's gonna get you white or black. So what you really want is to plug in a value between 0 and 1 here, just to make sure we're not accidentally getting some crazy value out of here and then adding something. Just put the saturate node. I kind of do that every time I use lerp. Now it would be so useful to have like a little drop down here and say like, okay, really clamp it between those two, you know, like don't extrapolate, but there isn't. And I think this is also pretty much it for this video. Once again, end it on a rant. Okay, this is it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, also feedback, criticism, like how I can make those tutorials a bit better, just let me know in the comments. And yeah, so here for example I also have this on a bird. I think that looks kind of cool, even though this one is a different position, so I might change the X and Y, what I showed you in the very beginning. And then of course you can take this entire thing, you can layer it, right? That's why I have this offset in here. You can make the waves a bit stronger, increase the noise, you know, make it really funky, or the colors, you could say, have the eyes different, maybe color it from top to bottom, whatever. I think there's so many cool things you can do with it. And if you do, please let me know. I'd like to take a look at it. So if you try to follow along and some things don't work, just let me know in the comments. I'm gonna try to help you out. And as always, subscribing, liking this video, having watched all the way to the end, that's already the best thing you could have done for me. So Thank you very much and goodbye.